I am the famous American. We need to discuss this further. What we're seeing here is that globally we can have a word in our minds and it can mean one thing here in the United States and yet a completely other thing in other parts of the world. So that word is, of course, ethnicity. I made a video that, in my mind, was going to be one of those videos people didn't really pay attention to, that people wouldn't really leave comments on. But this is a video that I think that received just dozens of comments. And this video that I'm referring to is called "There is no connection between ethnicity and facial features." When I hear that as an American, I'm thinking, of course it does. How else do you get facial features? How can you say that someone who is Jewish, who has DNA that goes back to Hebrew, etc., how can you say that they don't have a certain look compared to someone who's Chinese? And yes, we can distinguish between nationality and ethnicity. The word ethnicity, so I'm going to read this comment by Silent Bob, because I think that he embraces more of the un-American version of the mentality here. So here's what Silent Bob says on that video. Quote, "Ethnicity equals culture, in parentheses, language, religion, customs, traditions, shared values, end parentheses." And then he goes on to say, "Ethnicity does not equal DNA, such as facial features, appearance." He says, "It's simple. Your ethnicity is U.S. American, United States American." Okay, so that is, from what I'm perceiving here, that is the un-American, un-United States version of that concept of what ethnicity means. Because I think that most people here in the United States, when we hear ethnicity, we're going to lean immediately to the very thing that he said ethnicity is not. Which, yeah, I agree that as an American in the United States, when I think of ethnicity, I definitely think of appearance, facial features, etc. And I can, in my mind, trace it back to a certain part of the world, whether it's a nation that still exists or one that doesn't. You know, that's how Americans think here in the United States. So, well, what about the other parts that he had mentioned? Language, religion, customs, traditions, shared values. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter because you could be of Hebrew descent, but you may not be practicing Judaism. You may not actually be like me where you're kosher. There's so many ways that you can break tradition, but still, in my mind, you're part of that certain ethnic background. So I say, and then language? No, because, hey, we're here in the United States. We have people from all over speaking English. This is the main language people speak. So whatever their secondary language is, whatever, it's ultimately coming down to their ethnic background, aka physical appearance, that can predictably go back to a certain part of the world, because we are the United States. We are the melting pot. Everyone came here from somewhere else except for the Native Americans, which I think most people will agree with me, came through, the Bering Strait. They were like a long, long time ago. So there you go. I think what we've discovered with this is going to be one of those things that the more I make videos about it, the more I talk about it, we're going to ultimately disagree every time on the simple definition of ethnicity. So again, if you're part of the United States culture, you hear ethnicity, you immediately think DNA, like as far as how they look. I bet I could probably predict where their grandparents came from based on how they look, because people from Asia have certain type of eyes. People from Africa have a certain color skin that's darker than the rest of us, and so on. Oh, they got red hair? Probably from Scotland, Ireland, or England, etc. That's how we can use deductive reasoning to figure that out. And we are thinking about ethnicity, but we're not talking about language, customs, religion. See, and I think the reason, if we were to ask the question, okay, so even if I were to follow what you're saying, Nick, why why does ethnicity have a different context than the United States? Well, for me, again, it's about us being a melting pot. We are perhaps the most famous, largest melting pot that exists in the modern world, I would say. Maybe if I'm wrong, I guess I need to make that a different video. But you can imagine when you've got, at this point in history, in 2019, we've got so many people here from all over the world. And ultimately what happens is, especially by the second and third generation, what you see is the old language, it takes a back seat. Customs, tradition takes a back seat. What's left remaining? Physical appearance. And we can still know part of the story just by looking at people most of the time. So for us as a melting pot, ethnicity has nothing to do with those things that can get washed away by the second or third generation. It's all about the physical appearance in that situation. And if I need to remind everybody any of this, people say, well, why is the United States so obsessed with DNA and ethnicity? It's because we are living in the aftermath of outright racism. It's been a while since the Civil War. It's been a while since the Civil Rights Movement, all these things. But ultimately, it's now, if you live in the United States, you fill out forms all the time, whether it's a survey for a business, whether it is for the government, for the state, whatever it is, they're going to ask you your DNA, they ask you your ethnicity and your race, and they make them two separate things. So for example, and this is how I self-identify as white, but Hispanic. That's how I identify. And it's a choice. You get to decide, you get to determine how you identify, which is interesting. But when your own government forces you to fill out those forms your whole life, naturally, you, without realizing it, you've had to label yourself, and therefore, naturally, you label other people. Not as a bad thing or a good thing, or just as a thing. It is. We, at best, as Americans, we celebrate our diversity, but we recognize our diversity. And I'll closing note, I would say back in like the 1990s, early 90s, I feel the concept for Black Americans was this, was you're supposed to be, if you weren't black, you were supposed to be colorblind. You weren't supposed to see that they were black, because we're all equal. We're all brothers and sisters, and that was supposed to be the mentality. I don't see color. I don't see race. But we became more emotionally intelligent by the 2010s to where we got to the point where we say, you know what? I do see race and color, and I celebrate that. I recognize that. I celebrate that. It's a good thing. So yes, I do notice that you're black. I do notice you're of African heritage. And I do notice that here in the United States, that means something. African American people have a certain culture that white people don't have, that white people can't really understand unless they're quite involved in that. And I think I needed to share that example just to point that out. We're overly aware of what we perceive race, but specifically we think ethnicity. And for Black Americans, that's another concept. At this point in history, Black Americans have their own history as African Americans, more so than the traditions that necessarily go back to Africa. So this whole reboot, this whole melting pot really washes away all the parts of ethnicity that are listed there that perhaps people in Europe and the rest of the world think about when they hear the word ethnicity. So, closing thought, is it that the Americans are wrong? Because I think that would be the natural response for a lot of people that are not in the United States. Well, what if there's two different versions of what ethnicity means? It means one thing in the United States and when it means one thing in other parts. I really think the melting pot factor it carries a lot of weight. But I think this is similar to another thing we've learned in this channel. And that is how, when people in the United States refer to Mexicans, we don't care if they were born in Mexico or not. If you're born in the United States of Mexican heritage, you're Mexican. It doesn't even matter that your first language is English and you don't even know Spanish. Still, people will identify you as Mexican because they're going to see those predictable traits, what we perceive as ethnicity, your ethnicity being Mexican, not nationality. And see, that's what, even when I say that, it frustrates people who are in Europe. I know that. And I don't say that to frustrate people. I say that to remind everybody that here in this melting pot, things are different. Suddenly, national borders don't really matter so much as far as what we perceive as ethnicity, cultures, traditions, language don't matter so much. It's about looking at someone and knowing that we all are Americans, yet we all have these hints of where our own ancestors came from. This is interesting, I think. Your comments belong right here.